The final transmission crackled through the radio at 11:47 p.m. on October 15, 2019. Mayday, mayday. This is Windchaser. Something's wrong with the compass. All our instruments are, dear God, what is that light? Then silence. Nothing but static that would haunt the Coast Guard operators for months to come. What they discovered 3 days later, when they found the debris field, would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Bermuda Triangle and expose a terrifying truth that the maritime community has desperately tried to suppress. This isn't another story about alien abductions or supernatural forces. This is about something far more insidious, something that preys specifically on the most experienced sailors, those who think they've mastered the sea. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you believe about navigation, about trust, and about the thin line between confidence and fatal arrogance. The evidence will examine, piece by devastating piece, reveals why it's not the amateur weekend sailors who vanish in these waters, but the seasoned veterans who should know better. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why the most experienced captains are actually the most vulnerable, and why their decades of expertise become their greatest weakness in one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on Earth. This is a lesson that could save your life, because what happened to Captain Marcus Webb and his crew could happen to anyone who underestimates the psychological warfare the ocean wages against the human mind. Captain Marcus Webb wasn't just any sailor, he was a legend in the yachting community. At 62 years old, he had logged over 200,000 nautical miles across every major ocean on the planet. His weathered hands had gripped the wheel through Category 4 hurricanes in the North Atlantic, navigated treacherous ice floes in the Arctic Circle, and guided luxury yachts safely through pirate-infested waters off Somalia. Maritime magazines featured his adventures, and sailing schools used his techniques in their curricula. If there was a sailor who could handle anything the ocean threw at him, it was Marcus Webb. His crew aboard the Windchaser was equally impressive. Sarah Chen, 38, served as first mate and had been sailing competitively since she was 12. She held 3 world records in solo ocean racing and had rescued more distressed vessels than most Coast Guard crews. Her navigation skills were so precise that other sailors joked she could plot a course using only the stars and a broken compass. James Rodriguez, the engineer, was a former Navy submarine mechanic who could repair any mechanical system with nothing but spare parts and ingenuity. At 45, he had kept more boats running in impossible conditions than anyone had a right to expect. The boat itself was a masterpiece of maritime engineering, a custom-built 65-foot offshore cruiser that Marcus had commissioned specifically for long-range ocean voyages. Every system was redundant, every piece of safety equipment was top of the line, and every detail had been obsessively planned and maintained. The Windchaser carried 3 independent GPS systems, 2 radar units, emergency beacons, satellite communication equipment, and enough supplies for 6 months at sea. Marcus had invested nearly $2 million of his life savings into creating what he called the unsinkable dream. But this wasn't just about the money. For Marcus, the Windchaser represented the culmination of a lifetime spent on the water. He had grown up in a fishing family in Maine, where his grandfather taught him to read the sea like a book, to interpret the subtle changes in wave patterns, the shift in wind direction, the color of the water that warned of approaching storms. His father had died in a fishing accident when Marcus was 16, and from that moment he dedicated his life to understanding every secret the ocean held. He studied meteorology, oceanography, marine engineering, and emergency rescue techniques. He wasn't going to let the sea claim another member of his family. The dream that drove them into the Bermuda Triangle had been 25 years in the making. Marcus, Sarah, and James had met during a particularly brutal Atlantic crossing in 1995, when their separate boats had been caught in the same massive storm system. They had worked together via radio to navigate through the worst weather any of them had ever encountered. And from that shared trauma had grown a bond stronger than family. They had always talked about doing one final voyage together, the ultimate test of their combined skills and the perfect capstone to their careers. The plan was ambitious, but carefully calculated. They would sail from Miami through the heart of the Bermuda Triangle, past the Bahamas, and on to Bermuda itself. From there, they would continue to the Azores, then to the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and finally back to Miami. A complete circumnavigation that would take them through some of the most challenging waters on Earth. It was a route that would test every skill they had developed over decades of sailing. Marcus had spent 3 years planning every detail of the journey. He studied weather patterns, ocean currents, political situations in every port they might visit, and potential emergency protocols for dozens of scenarios. Sarah had plotted 3 different routes for each leg of the journey, with alternate ports and safe harbors marked on detailed charts. James had completely rebuilt the engine, upgraded every electrical system, and installed backup systems for the backup systems. They had even practiced emergency procedures in controlled conditions, timing how quickly they could deploy life rafts, activate distress beacons, and abandon ship if necessary. The preparation was so thorough that other sailors called it obsessive. Marcus would wake up at 4 a.m. to check weather reports, adjust their planned departure date based on barometric pressure readings, and run through emergency checklists one more time. Sarah would spend hours cross-referencing GPS coordinates with paper charts, ensuring that their electronic navigation systems matched traditional maritime maps. James would test and retest every piece of equipment, replacing parts that showed even the slightest sign of wear. Their families thought they were crazy to attempt such an ambitious voyage at their ages, but their fellow sailors understood. This was more than just a sailing trip. It was a validation of everything they had worked for, everything they had learned, and everything they believed about their mastery of the sea. They had collectively sailed over 500,000 nautical miles without a single major incident. They had rescued other sailors, weathered storms that sank commercial vessels, and navigated through conditions that would have terrified most people. If anyone could complete this journey safely, it was the crew of the Windchaser. The first 6 months of their voyage exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. They sailed from Miami through the Caribbean with perfect weather and calm seas. Their stop in the Bahamas was exactly as planned, and they reached Bermuda ahead of schedule, with all systems functioning perfectly. The passage across the Atlantic to the Azores was textbook perfect. Steady winds, following seas, and navigation so precise that they arrived within 5 minutes of their estimated time. Other sailors they met in ports along the way marveled at their preparation, their equipment, and their obvious competence. From the Azores to the Mediterranean, they encountered their first serious weather, a late-season storm that generated 15-foot seas and 40-knot winds. But this was exactly the kind of challenge they had trained for, and they handled it with professional calm. Marcus adjusted their course to minimize stress on the boat. Sarah kept them perfectly on track, despite the challenging conditions, and James ensured that every system continued to function flawlessly. They rode out the storm like the experienced professionals they were, and when they reached Gibraltar, they celebrated with the quiet satisfaction of sailors who had handled serious conditions without breaking a sweat. The Mediterranean leg was almost relaxing by comparison. They visited ancient ports, enjoyed perfect sailing weather, and fine-tuned their systems based on lessons learned during the Atlantic crossing. Other sailors they met consistently remarked on the obvious competence of their crew and the exceptional condition of their boat. They were living the dream they had planned for decades, and everything was going exactly according to plan. The passage through the Suez Canal and into the Red Sea presented new challenges: bureaucratic delays, extreme heat, and crowded shipping lanes. But again, their preparation paid off. Marcus had all the proper documentation ready months in advance. James had installed additional cooling systems for the engine room, and Sarah had studied the traffic patterns to ensure they could navigate safely through some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. They handled each challenge with the same methodical competence they had demonstrated throughout their careers. The Indian Ocean crossing was perhaps their finest moment as a crew. They encountered everything from dead calms that required careful engine management to preserve fuel, to monsoon conditions that tested every aspect of their seamanship, but they worked together with the precision of a team that had been sailing together for decades, anticipating each other's actions and handling every situation with professional competence. When they reached South Africa, they had been at sea for over a year and had not encountered a single situation they couldn't handle. The passage around the Cape of Good Hope was legendary among sailors for its treacherous conditions, but the crew of the Windchaser made it look easy. They timed their passage to avoid the worst weather, maintained their equipment perfectly, and handled the notorious swells and wind shifts with the skill of true professionals. Other sailors in Cape Town treated them like celebrities, and Marcus was invited to speak at the local yacht club about their techniques for long-range ocean sailing. But it was during those successful months that the seeds of their destruction were being planted. With each challenge they overcame, with each perfect navigation solution, and each flawless equipment repair, their confidence grew. They began to see themselves not just as competent sailors, but as sailors who had transcended the normal limitations that affected other people. They had proven that proper preparation, superior equipment, and professional competence could overcome any challenge the ocean presented. Marcus started to talk about their system, the combination of thorough planning, redundant equipment, and skilled execution that made them immune to the kind of accidents that plagued lesser sailors. Sarah began to rely more heavily on their electronic navigation systems, confident that their multiple GPS units and radar systems provided information more accurate than traditional navigation methods. James became convinced that their mechanical systems were so well maintained and redundantly designed that mechanical failure was essentially impossible. Most dangerously, they started to develop a subtle contempt for the stories of sailors who had encountered problems in challenging waters. When they heard about vessels that had run into trouble in storms, they would analyze what those sailors had done wrong, how better preparation or superior equipment would have prevented the problem. They weren't cruel about it, but there was a growing sense that they had achieved a level of competence that put them beyond the reach of the accidents that affected other sailors. This psychological shift was so gradual that none of them recognized it. They still performed their safety checks, still maintained their equipment, still planned their routes carefully, but underneath their professional competence, a dangerous arrogance was growing. The kind of arrogance that comes from a long string of successes and a growing belief that you have mastered forces that are fundamentally uncontrollable. The return journey across the South Atlantic was another flawless performance. They averaged over 150 nautical miles per day, arrived at each waypoint exactly on schedule, and handled several minor equipment issues with their usual competence. When they reached the Caribbean again, they were just 800 nautical miles from completing one of the most ambitious private sailing voyages ever attempted. They had been at sea for 18 months, had sailed nearly 30,000 nautical miles, and had not encountered a single situation that had seriously challenged their abilities. It was Sarah who suggested the final route home. Instead of taking the safe, well-traveled path along the Caribbean islands, she proposed that they sail directly through the heart of the Bermuda Triangle. It would save them nearly 200 nautical miles and would be a fitting end to their epic voyage, a demonstration that their superior skills and equipment made them immune to whatever mysterious forces were supposed to lurk in those waters. Marcus loved the idea immediately. The Bermuda Triangle represented everything he despised about amateur sailors and sensationalized maritime journalism. He had sailed through those waters dozens of times in his career and had never encountered anything more mysterious than unusual weather patterns and strong currents. The stories of disappearing vessels were simply the result of poor seamanship, inadequate preparation, and inferior equipment. Taking the Windchaser through the Triangle would be his final statement about the superiority of professional competence over superstitious fear. James was initially reluctant, not because he believed in supernatural explanations, but because he knew the area was prone to sudden weather changes and unusual magnetic variations that could affect their navigation systems. But Marcus and Sarah convinced him that their redundant systems and superior preparation made them immune to the kind of problems that had affected other vessels. After all, they had just sailed around the world without a major incident. What could a 400 nautical mile passage through the Bermuda Triangle do to a crew of their caliber? They entered the Triangle on October 13th, 2019, with perfect weather and calm seas. Their GPS systems showed them exactly on course. Their radar showed no other traffic in the area, and their weather forecasting equipment predicted continued favorable conditions for the next 48 hours. Marcus was actually enjoying the irony of completing their epic voyage through waters that were supposed to be mysterious and dangerous. They would have a great story to tell when they got back to Miami. For the first day, everything proceeded exactly as planned. They made excellent time in light, following winds. All their systems functioned perfectly, and they were ahead of schedule for their arrival in Miami. Marcus took the opportunity to start composing the story he would tell about their voyage, focusing on how proper preparation and professional competence could overcome any challenge. Sarah began planning their triumphant arrival, and James started thinking about the maintenance work he would need to do on the boat before their next adventure. But on the evening of October 14th, something began to go wrong. It started so subtly that none of them noticed it at first. The GPS readings began to show tiny inconsistencies, differences of just a few hundred yards between their three independent systems. The radar began to show intermittent contacts that would appear for a few minutes and then disappear. The magnetic compass started to swing slowly between readings that differed by several degrees. Marcus dismissed the GPS inconsistencies as normal variations between different satellite systems. Sarah attributed the radar contacts to atmospheric conditions that were causing false returns. James explained the compass variations as the result of local magnetic anomalies that were well documented in the area. Each of them had a rational explanation for what they were seeing, and none of the variations were large enough to affect their navigation significantly. But the inconsistencies continued to grow throughout the night. By dawn, on October 15th, their three GPS systems were showing positions that differed by nearly a mile. The radar was showing multiple contacts that would appear and disappear apparently at random. The magnetic compass was swinging through an arc of nearly 30 degrees. More troubling, their electronic charts were beginning to show impossible readings. Depths that changed from 12,000 feet to 200 feet and back again. Water temperatures that varied by 20 degrees within the span of a few minutes. Marcus called a crew meeting to discuss what they were seeing. Each of them had a different theory about what was happening, but they all agreed that their fundamental navigation was still sound. They knew approximately where they were. They were still making progress toward Miami, and none of the anomalies were severe enough to represent a real danger. They decided to continue on course and monitor their systems more closely. What they didn't realize was that their long string of successes had made them psychologically incapable of recognizing when they were in real danger. They had become so accustomed to solving every problem with superior equipment and professional competence that they couldn't accept that they might be encountering something beyond their control. Each anomaly had a rational explanation. Each problem had a technical solution, and each challenge could be overcome with the same methods that had worked throughout their 18-month voyage. By noon on October 15th, the situation had deteriorated dramatically, but they were still trying to solve it with the same systematic approach that had worked everywhere else. Their GPS systems were now showing positions that differed by more than 5 miles, but they convinced themselves that local atmospheric conditions were interfering with satellite reception. The radar was showing contacts in impossible positions, boats that appeared to be sailing underwater, aircraft that were flying below sea level. But they attributed this to equipment malfunction. Most disturbing of all, they began to see things that weren't registering on any of their instruments. Sarah spotted what appeared to be land on the horizon in a direction where their charts showed nothing but deep ocean. Marcus saw lights in the sky that moved in patterns unlike any aircraft he had ever seen. James heard sounds coming through the hull, rhythmic pounding like someone hammering on the outside of the boat, that their sensitive underwater microphones weren't detecting. Each of them began to doubt their own perceptions, but none of them was willing to admit that they might be losing their ability to navigate. They had invested too much of their identity in being competent sailors, and acknowledging that they were lost would be like admitting that their entire careers had been based on illusion. Instead, they began to make increasingly desperate attempts to rationalize what they were experiencing. Marcus became convinced that they were the victims of some kind of military experiment, that advanced technology was being used to interfere with their navigation systems as part of a classified test. Sarah began to suspect that their instruments had been sabotaged by someone who wanted to prevent them from completing their voyage. James started to believe that the boat itself was malfunctioning in ways that their diagnostic systems couldn't detect. Each theory led them to make decisions that took them further from safety. Marcus changed course repeatedly, trying to avoid what he believed were military test zones. Sarah began to ignore their instrument readings entirely, relying instead on her intuition about which direction would take them to safety. James shut down and restarted critical systems, trying to clear what he believed were electronic malfunctions. By evening on October 15th, they were completely lost. Their GPS systems were showing locations that were hundreds of miles apart. Their compass was spinning freely, and their charts showed geographic features that kept changing. They could see lights and shapes in the water around them, but their instruments insisted that they were alone in the middle of the ocean. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable, but each of them was still trying to maintain the facade of professional competence that had defined their careers. The final crisis began at 11:30 p.m. when their engine suddenly stopped. James rushed to the engine room and found that all the mechanical systems appeared to be functioning normally, but the engine simply would not run. The batteries were fully charged, the fuel system was working perfectly, and all the electronic controls showed normal readings. But the engine was completely dead. Without power, they would be at the mercy of currents and winds that they could no longer predict or understand. Marcus tried to restart the engine using emergency procedures, while Sarah attempted to deploy their emergency sail configuration. But their familiar systems seemed to be working in impossible ways. The engine would turn over normally, but would not fire. Despite having fuel, spark, and compression, the sails would not hold the wind, even though there was clearly a strong breeze blowing. Their emergency equipment seemed to be functioning normally according to all their instruments, but nothing was actually working. At 11:47 p.m., Marcus made the final radio transmission that the Coast Guard would receive. Mayday, Mayday, this is Windchaser. Something's wrong with the compass. All our instruments are... Dear God, what is that light? The transmission cut off abruptly, and subsequent attempts to reach them received no response. 3 days later, the Coast Guard found a debris field scattered across more than 50 square nautical miles. The debris included pieces of the Windchaser's hull, personal belongings from the crew, and fragments of their sophisticated electronic equipment. But the pattern of the debris field made no sense. The pieces were scattered in a way that suggested the boat had been broken apart while moving at high speed, but there was no evidence of an explosion, fire, or collision. More puzzling still, the debris contained components from systems that shouldn't have been on the Windchaser at all. The Coast Guard found pieces of navigation equipment from vessels that had disappeared in the Triangle decades earlier. personal belongings from sailors who had vanished in the 1980s, and electronic components from boats that had been lost before GPS technology even existed. It was as if the Windchaser had somehow collided with the ghosts of every vessel that had ever been lost in those waters. The investigation that followed revealed the most disturbing evidence of all. The Windchaser's emergency locator beacon had been activated, but instead of transmitting their actual position, it had sent a signal indicating that they were simultaneously in dozens of different locations across the triangle. Their satellite communication system had continued to function for nearly 6 hours after their final radio transmission, but the messages it sent were fragmented and contradictory. Reports of impossible positions, bizarre weather conditions, and encounters with other vessels that had been lost years before. Most disturbing of all was the ship's log, which was recovered intact from a waterproof safe. The final entries, written in Marcus's familiar handwriting, described experiences that defied rational explanation. They wrote about sailing through underwater canyons filled with the wrecks of other vessels, about following navigation lights that led them in circles, about meeting other sailors who claimed to have been lost in the triangle for decades. But the real revelation came from the psychological analysis of those final log entries. Maritime psychologists who studied the handwriting and the content of the messages identified a clear pattern that explained everything that had happened to the Windchaser and her crew. It wasn't supernatural forces or military experiments that had destroyed the most competent sailors to enter the Bermuda Triangle in decades. It was their own expertise. The analysis revealed that the crew of the Windchaser had fallen victim to a psychological phenomenon known as expert blindness, the inability of highly skilled individuals to recognize when they are encountering situations that their expertise cannot handle. Their decades of successful sailing had created a mental framework that required them to find rational, solvable explanations for everything they encountered. When they began to experience navigation anomalies in the triangle, they were psychologically incapable of accepting that they might be truly lost. The Bermuda Triangle, according to the investigation, creates a perfect storm of conditions that exploit this psychological weakness in experienced sailors. The area's unusual magnetic properties, unpredictable weather patterns, and complex current systems create navigation challenges that cannot be solved using conventional seamanship. But experienced sailors, like the crew of the Windchaser, are so invested in their ability to solve navigation problems that they continue to make increasingly dangerous decisions rather than admit that they are lost. Less experienced sailors, according to the psychological analysis, are actually safer in the triangle because they are more willing to admit when they are confused and more likely to call for help before their situation becomes critical. Amateur sailors will activate emergency beacons at the first sign of trouble and accept rescue from the Coast Guard without feeling that their competence is being questioned. But expert sailors continue to try to solve unsolvable problems until they have traveled so far from their intended course that rescue becomes impossible. The investigation revealed that this pattern had been repeated dozens of times over the decades. The sailors who disappear in the Bermuda Triangle are almost always the most experienced, most competent, and best equipped sailors who enter those waters. They are sailors like Marcus Webb, Sarah Chen, and James Rodriguez, professionals who have built their identities around their ability to handle any challenge the ocean presents. When they encounter conditions that cannot be mastered through skill and preparation, they literally cannot accept defeat until it is too late to save themselves. The debris field from the Windchaser told the final part of the story. The scattered equipment from other vessels showed that the crew had continued to sail for hours after their final radio transmission, desperately trying to solve navigation problems that had no solution. They had pushed their boat and their systems beyond all reasonable limits, refusing to accept that they were lost until their vessel simply disintegrated from the impossible stresses they were placing on it. The tragedy of the Windchaser was not that 3 experienced sailors made mistakes or encountered conditions beyond their abilities. The tragedy was that their very expertise became the instrument of their destruction. They were so competent, so professional, and so confident in their abilities that they could not recognize when competence was not enough. They died not because they were bad sailors, but because they were such good sailors that they could not admit when they needed help. The Coast Guard changed their search and rescue protocols in the Triangle as a direct result of what they learned from the Windchaser incident. They now monitor the area more closely for vessels showing signs of navigation confusion, and they are trained to be more aggressive in offering assistance to boats that appear to be having problems. Most importantly, they now understand that the most experienced sailors are often the ones in the greatest danger because their expertise makes them reluctant to call for help until it is too late. The maritime community has been slow to accept these findings because they challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between experience and safety. But the evidence is overwhelming. In the Bermuda Triangle, expertise kills. The psychological need to maintain competence in the face of unsolvable problems turns the skills that make sailors successful everywhere else into fatal liabilities. The lesson of the Windchaser extends far beyond sailing and far beyond the Bermuda Triangle. It's a reminder that expertise carried too far becomes a form of blindness that can be more dangerous than inexperience. The confidence that comes from a lifetime of success can become a trap that prevents us from recognizing when we need help. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing we can have is absolute confidence in our abilities. For sailors planning to transit the Bermuda Triangle, the message is clear. Prepare for the possibility that your skills will not be enough. Set strict limits on how long you will try to solve navigation problems before calling for help. Accept that there are conditions in those waters that cannot be mastered through seamanship, and be prepared to swallow your pride and ask for rescue before your situation becomes critical. The sea does not care about your experience, your equipment, or your reputation. It will humble the most accomplished sailor as easily as it will claim the most inexperienced amateur. The crew of the Windchaser learned this lesson too late, but their sacrifice can serve as a warning for every sailor who follows in their wake. The most experienced sailors disappear in the Bermuda Triangle because their experience tells them they should be able to handle anything. They cannot accept that there are waters where competence is not enough, where the best response to being lost is to stop trying to solve the problem and start asking for help. Their expertise becomes their enemy, and the sea claims another group of sailors who were too good to admit they needed rescue. If you found this story compelling and want to learn more about the hidden dangers that even experienced sailors face, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. The ocean holds many secrets, and some of them can only be understood by those willing to acknowledge that expertise has its limits. Share this story with any sailor you know. It might save their life someday.